Okay, Ransom Reviews back and trying something new today. This is my first video podcast ever, and let me tell you, it's been an absolute shit show trying to get this set up. Um, I got my virtual background behind me. I might disappear while we're doing this because it's literally a towel. It's literally a green towel hanging on a laundry rack behind me. No green screen, I've got like 14 apps open right now. I'm using PowerPoint, Google Slides, Zoom, webcam, microphone, Microsoft Word. I have no idea what's going on. I'm way out of my comfort zone, but that's how you grow. So what we're looking at today is, oh yeah, that is my library behind me. So cool. What we're looking at today is this summer, my holiday, I got into audiobooks. I found out there's this really cool trick I can do where I can play video games on mute and listen to audiobooks at the same time and just take my unproductivity to an elite level. So you can see the 7 audiobooks that I have listened to in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I would say. You can see I started with really short audiobooks. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius and A Book of Five Rings are quite short. And now I've worked my way up to the largest books of mankind. Swan Song by Robert R. McCammon is about 1,000 pages long. So let me just break down these books for you, which ones I liked, which ones I didn't, why, and we'll see how this first ever video podcast goes. Hopefully the towel behind me doesn't fall down halfway through the podcast. Okay. So the first book I listened to while I was actually building one of these bookshelves from IKEA behind me was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I was actually surprised how much I enjoyed this book. As usually, inspirational quotes tend to make me projectile vomit, like I've got a 6th grade science project volcano in my belly, and this book is just jammed full of shit you'd expect to see framed above somebody you hate's toilet. But Marcus Aurelius just seems like such a nice, thoughtful, reasonable guy. I just felt like, aw, shucks, he's lovely. Now, what's crazy about that is he was a Roman emperor. He was writing a lot of this while on campaign, removing heads from shoulders. Such a fascinating dichotomy. Possibly the original tender warrior. He's definitely responsible for inspiring a lot of fantasy tropes. It's wild to think that someone with all that power was writing a journal filled with ideas such as be nice to people because it feels good. I've always been fascinated with the Roman Empire. It really has everything. You've got the classic god complex dictators like Caesar. You've got Caligula doing body shots out of horses' butts. And you've got good old Marcus that's just like, can't we all just get along? I would highly recommend reading this book as it's brimming with practical thoughts that are absolutely still relevant to life today. Just please don't take the quotes and frame them in your bathroom. So yeah, I gave Meditations by Marcus Aurelius 8 out of 10. It's really, really good. The next book I listened to was A Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. This book I gave a 5 out of 10. Not my favorite. So unlike Meditations, this book's messages don't really translate that well into today's world. I know some people like to say that it's good for cutthroat businessmen, but I think that's a stretch. Does a businessman need to know how to cinch his sword the correct way in his belt, or in which direction he should stand in regards to the sun, or specific techniques on how to train with 2 swords? This book is written by arguably the greatest sword fighter that ever lived, and it's exactly what you'd expect in that sort of book. It talks about the training, the stances, the discipline, the specific techniques of cutting and slashing and stabbing, how to fight on different terrains, inside houses, against multiple opponents. Again, none of this is applicable to today's world. I listened to this on audiobook mainly because I love Japanese history in particular the Edo period and the samurai culture. I've always been interested in Musashi, and so that part of it was interesting. Just listening to him giving the essentials on how to become a badass killer samurai. But make no mistake, this book is really designed to prepare yourself to be a badass, murderous samurai. The next book I listened to was The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This one was a little bit better for me than A Book of Five Rings. I gave The Art of War a 6 out of 10. It's another ancient classic about warfare. And like I said, a little bit more applicable to modern life, as there is some advice here about how to treat your subordinates and how to be duplicitous with your enemies in order to gain an advantage. But again, most of what is here is incredibly specific to Sun Tzu's time. Advice on supply trains, advantageous terrain, avoiding prolonged conflicts or conflicts altogether, and also avoiding honesty at all costs. This book is obviously niche in that it details how to be the best military strategist in 5th century China. But if you have any interest in that sort of stuff, I don't think you'll find a better book than this. Sun Tzu was clearly not only a brilliant military strategist, but also incredibly articulate, as you can feel your brain conquering an imaginary risk board using his sage advice. And with a focus on being purposely decisive and how to lead men effectively, I can see why this book has transcended what could have been a niche audience. I'm not a soldier or a businessman, and honestly have no interest in either, and I still found this book to be quite interesting. The next book I listened to was The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. This one was pretty good, and I gave it a 7 out of 10 overall. It was just a continuation of my audiobook addiction, and this is a volume of genre-defining short stories. It had been on my list for years and had proven really difficult to find, and so I finally decided to just listen to it on YouTube. I found his prose difficult but mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. If he had a club, it would be called Jack Trance. If he had a drugstore, it would be called Crack Vance. Okay, moving on. Usually I dislike verbose writers, but for some reason I really enjoyed Vance's style. His characterizations, his descriptions of landscapes and plant life, gosh, so nice. Listening to it made me feel really dumb, like I only know 13 words, as if I'm struggling to wrap my mind around my own language. The quality of the stories is uneven, but they do all share similar themes. Sneaky, arrogant, misogynistic magicians, women that are evil, either evil or sexual fantasies personified, magic spells and trickery and mind-bending surroundings. Vance seemingly isn't that well known, considering he was a major influence for both George R.R. Martin and Dungeons and Dragons. I can certainly see both connections, although admittedly more Dungeons and Dragons than George Martin. The way he describes the excellent prismatic spell is, well, it's magical. I've seen some complaints from women about the female characters in his stories since it's 2020 and humanity's duty to travel through time, correcting all wrongs, particularly with offensive statues and fictional writing. I get it. Vance can spend pages describing how flexible a girl's mouth is. But the way I saw it was that none of his characters are likable. His male characters all suffer from hubris and are sneaky dickheads, and his female characters reek of the worst sort of geek fantasy. That being said, his writing is insanely descriptive and transformative and enrapturing, for me at least. I think his prose alone makes his work worth visiting. So I continued down the Vancian hole. I listened to The Eyes of the Overworld by Jack Vance. This was the second book in the Dying Earth series. And this one I didn't like as much. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Typical for me, Oftentimes when I read series, the first book in the series is my favorite. And this is a bit different than the first in the Dying Earth series because the first book was short stories, a compilation of short stories that were loosely tied together. While as book 2, The Eyes of the Overworld, is a proper book. So it certainly has better structure and direction than the first. But again, the main character here is really unlikable. And since you're stuck with him throughout the entire book, I found my motivation sometimes waning as I felt a bit confused as to the purpose of the journey. Eventually, just giving in and understanding that he's not meant to be likable and having a laugh at some of the ridiculous situations he gets himself into is definitely the right approach. The Vancian prose is here again, and yes, I still enjoy it immensely. Although I'm sure I'll disprove it shortly, I can feel myself getting smarter listening to his writing. It's decadent, and some might find it overpowering. Apparently, the Dying Earth series continues with Kugel, who is the unlikable protagonist here. So I'm not sure I'll continue with the series. Still, I'm glad that I finally gave Vance some of my time. And while I didn't love the books, I enjoyed them and found them to be impressive and memorable. Next was Beneath a Scarlet Sky by Mark Sullivan. This one I absolutely loved from start to finish, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. So this is, like I said, my favorite audiobook on this recent addiction. It's a book about a kid in Italy living through World War II, and I'm borderline obsessed with all things World War II, and this book did not disappoint. First, it's important to note that this is historical fiction. The author located a gold mine in the protagonist Pino Leila, as he is a larger-than-life personality. But he readily admits to filling in gaps, combining characters for a better narrative structure, and sucker punching you in the liver when you get too happy. You know, all the techniques you need to manipulate an amazing story out of a very good one. But it's hard not to love Pino as he evolves from a love-horny teenager that just wants to smell a girl's hair, maybe Biden is his grandpa, into a bona fide hero. As is often the case with heroes, he doesn't seek out heroic deeds. Rather, he's put into difficult situations where he rises to the occasion and reacts heroically. Some of the themes in this book are time sensitive, and some are timeless. To use a video game term, the fog of war here is immense. Radios are contraband, and no one seems to have any idea of what Hitler is really up to. In fact, it's hard to discern what Italy's role in this war is altogether. They're on the fence, being pushed to either side, and no matter which side they dip their toes in, they get bit. Italy's history in World War II is fascinating. Allies to Germany originally, and losing every engagement, and then eventually switching sides in 1943 and losing every engagement, and then warring against themselves, fascists versus partisans. I guess they couldn't lose every engagement there since they were fighting themselves. Anyway, the book doesn't focus on the Italian history aspect too much. The story instead focuses on Pino, his family, his friends, and his colleagues. Pino falling in love just by looking at a girl also feels very 1940s. You see a girl once, you get married. You go off to war, you die. And you die happily married. I'm not sure this kind of love exists in today's world anymore. I guess when the stakes are higher, you're more willing to take big risks. But generally, this is where many of the story elements are timeless. Pino's relationship with his younger brother, Mimo, is incredibly relatable. Having a big brother myself who punched me in the face a few times when we were kids, I deserved it. They have that same sort of relationship. They're family. And of course, that means they're close. And at times, they're best friends. And at times, they're worst enemies because of the situations around them. They fight each other, and yet they always forgive and remain close. His relationships with his best friend, Carlito, showcases how inseparable friends remain friends even when separated. I think that makes sense. Yeah. His relationship with his parents and his uncle, the friends he makes along the way, form connections that help him later in life. These are timeless themes. This book might also feature the most likable religious figures ever. Unlike the church I'm familiar with, that seems populated with hypocrites and delusional predators, these priests and cardinals in this book are kind and firm and live ascetic lives. They don't prattle on and on about God. They just try to do the right thing. That's when you know you're reading fiction for sure. The emotion in this book is just like the mountain passes Pinot navigates. It climbs to the highest peaks and sinks to the lowest valleys. All of the characters are fascinating. The historical backdrop is fascinating. Pinot's journey is fascinating. I will say that when the conflict ended, the book started to drag a bit towards the end, but right when I thought perhaps it should have ended already, the author pumps you full of another round of emotional bullets. It's just an awesome book on all levels, and I highly recommend it. Now the one that I just finished, my most recent audiobook, which was an absolute monster, Swan Song by Robert McCammon. This is a 32-hour long audiobook, so definitely something to tackle on your holiday, or if you need to drive across the entire country to visit a relative. Nearly 1,000 pages, and everybody compares this book to Stephen King's The Stand. I get it. The connections are obvious. Both books are absurdly long. They're both post-apocalyptic. They both have a wacky bad guy. They both feature non-heroes being heroes. But there are some differences as well. In The Stand, everybody got wiped out by a virus, and the book culminates in a good versus evil showdown in Vegas. In Swan Song, everybody got wiped out by nuclear weapons. And while there certainly is conflict between good and evil, it felt to me more like there was just a handful of good people and everybody else was bad to worse. They ranged from do whatever it takes to survive to let's take a bad situation and make it worse. There's also a bit of a Mad Max feel in here as well, as you have groups of bandits roving and raiding. And there's also a little bit of Fallout, not full-on mutants, but humans and animals that have undergone some pretty radical changes. I guess what I'm trying to say is that while this book certainly has a lot of parallels with King's The Stand, it offers enough of its own flavor to justify being its own entity. The Stand is one of my favorite books of all time, and while I didn't quite rate Swan Song as high, I did think it was pretty awesome. There's a horse that's a hero, the anti-BoJack Horseman. There's a nice dog with a mean name. There's a lady who swings her bag at people. And there's Eminem's daughter. I loved the characters in this story. I thought the use of language was vivid and descriptive in a gnarly way. And overall, I was really impressed. The length definitely makes this book a bit daunting. And it's probably a bit hard to find nowadays as it was written in the 80s. But you could just do what I did and listen to the audiobook on YouTube. The narrator is great. And just imagine a traveling circus running a marathon. It might be long, but it's never boring. So that's it. We survived. The blanket is still up. So thanks for listening. These were just the 7 audiobooks that I've been hammering through the last couple of weeks. I will try to get another video up shortly, going over some of the books I've been reading in paperback as well. As you can see, I've got lots of books to get through. So let me know how you felt about this new strange format, how the audio quality was. If you read any of the books that I read, let me know if you agree or disagree, and I'll see you next time on Ransom Reviews.